considerations in sport and exercise science research. So there are two main things that you need to consider when wanting to partake in research into a certain area, or in general, any kind of research. There's the ethical principles and legal principles you have to follow. So ethical is more a person's morals, so what they think is right or wrong and what the general population thinks is right or wrong, and it generally avoids physical or mental harm. So if you see something you think that is wrong, then it's generally, without the law telling you, that is your ethical principle. And legal is working within the civil law that is set up by the government, so if you break them then you obviously face a lot of consequences. But ethical, you only face like your own guilt. Reasons for ethical guidelines. So before 1947 there was no code of conduct within research until the end of the Second World War, when Nuremberg created a code which everyone who wanted to do an experiment must comply with. This was because of the treatment that the Nazis did to prisoners in their camps. It was so terrible and so nasty that it set a way for ethics to be more important. So they would test the not even participants, they're just the prisoners, like by putting gas, using the effects of like mustard gas that they went on to use in the war, put them in freezing temperatures to test out like uniforms, and unfortunately multiple people died. So now there's the Nuremberg Code, which is the 10 points that make up a set of ethical principles. For example, voluntary human consent is essential, so you can't force someone into taking part in the research because you want them to. They have to agree by themselves and be a volunteer. You can't just experiment because you want to. It has to have some importance into everyone. Like it has to have some reason for doing it. So you can't just test people's health for something in a drug to do that and see if that benefits them, unless there's a reason, because you think it's generally going to help. You can't just try people on loads of drugs and see what happens. You have to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental harm. You have to take all the precautions to make sure that everything is safe. So nowadays there's like bases and ethical committees within where you work, so in each research place or uni, which makes sure that all these are followed, so everything is prepared so nothing can go wrong. Each person must be able to withdraw at any time, and if the experiment is not going the way it should and it looks like it's going to get dangerous, it has to be terminated. There's two main theorists that helped also develop ethics and understand that some people don't really care. So there was the Zimbardo study of the Stanford prison experiment, where the treatment within the research, which wasn't set out to happen but did, became shocking and caused both physical and mental harm to the people that were the prisoners, and even like mental harm to the guards, like a few years down the line, where they realised that the treatment of how they treated their fellow students was so bad that it affected them. So it wasn't very nice, as it didn't apply with the ethics that most people would follow. And the Milgram study, which was giving electric shocks. So there was a learner and a teacher, and the teacher would ask the learner questions, and in this experiment the teacher didn't know that the learner wasn't actually getting electric shocks, but when they got them wrong they continued to give an electric shock until from 15 volts, which was a slight shock, to 450, which is a severe shock which could cause death. And they knew that in their minds, but they still didn't think about their ethical principles within themselves, because it wasn't against the law, and they went against that, and that showed that how big of a part that ethics has to play when in research so people can't get hurt. So nowadays we have BASES. This is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, and they make sure that every single research that's carried out by researchers, whether they're at uni or accredited researchers, are following the ethical and legal guidelines. And before they start research, they have to fill in paperwork which allows them to get ethical clearance, which means that they have to write down their procedure, the method, what they're going to use, like if they're going to prompt the participants to carry on, and then BASES will look at this and think, oh, is that following their ethics, and then pick up on things where something could go wrong, or see that it's perfectly fine and allow it to happen. So scenario 1, the effectiveness of continuous altitude training on young athletes in their levels of cardiovascular fitness. So in this research, it would be essential that more steps are taken to make sure it complies with the ethical and legal guidelines, as it's working with young children. Young children are at higher risk than adults, as they cannot fully consent to everything they do before they reach the age of 18. Before conducting research, the researcher needs to have a CRB check or DSB check, which allows them to work with children in this sort of environment. Without this, the work could be against the law. For example, if the researcher needs to do tests on an athlete which require them to touch them, so doing a blood test or taking their pulse or anything, and they do not have this check, and say someone misconstrues this and sees it in a different way, then they could potentially face prison, like a law sentence, could potentially being seen to break the law and could face a prison sentence or a fine or suspension. The researcher in this case made sure they had parental consent because they're under 18 prior to the experiment, and therefore no consequences could be issued by failing to follow this, as the child has been consented for, and obviously they'll get a participant disclaimer telling them everything that was going to happen, and then that if something was going to go wrong, that they've had consent, and they, as far as they know, they will comply with it, and everyone will do the most they can to prevent things from happening because it's following proper procedure. They also made it clear to the young athletes that if they wanted to stop at any point in the experiment, they could, no matter what. This is called the right to withdraw, and within the moral and legal principles, they cannot forcibly make someone to carry on just for the sake of research. So if one of the athletes found it too hard and too challenging and wanted to stop, and the researcher didn't let him, that could cause an inquest into the research to see if it's even got any accreditation to it, or is it just making children continue when they don't. So it's not actually looking at cardiovascular fitness, it's just like forcing them to carry on. If they forced an athlete to carry on without wanting them to, for example, and they got injured or just generally they could become physically or psychologically hurt because they're being forced to do something that they don't want to do, they'd be liable and possibly suspended from future work until a tribunal has taken place. So a tribunal is a process where a court-like procedure is held in order to get to the bottom of what and where the experiment went wrong. However, before the experiment, they did get ethical clearance from BASES and the University Ethical Board, making sure that they planned to do followed within the ethical and legal guidelines. So as long as that complies, they would have nothing to worry about. If they were taking a test and they, within the scientific principles of it, did something wrong, for example, was taking blood or something and did it wrong and caused harm to someone, that could lead to scientific misconduct, and ultimately cause harm to a person. So that could also lead to more ethical training, more training in general of their actual skills, and ultimately could look at all their research and get it discredited. Scenario 2 is the effectiveness on punishment in girls' football in relation to the level of accuracy in the shots. So they would have to get informed consent for a start, because they need to know exactly what they are signing up to. Obviously the team would be approached to see if they wanted to take part, and obviously if someone didn't, then they wouldn't take part, because then they're not consenting and they've got to be volunteers. They obviously have a right to withdraw, because it wouldn't be necessarily a nice thing to go through. Like, that some people react badly to punishment, not punishment, but like bad criticism. They need to make sure that they had a debrief at the end of the experiment. So at the end of the football session, when the research is over, they need to make sure that the girls are debriefed to say, look, you didn't really do anything wrong. This was just part of the experiment to see if it had an effect on the level of accuracy. So technically they can't be the deception part. It'd have to be a double-blind sort of experiment, because, it'd have to be the girls wouldn't necessarily know that they're measuring, because of the punishment and negative feedback that would have, they can't know in their heads that they're measuring whether that has an effect on the level of accuracy, because social desirability could take place. So if they know in their heads that is what's happening, and after someone's been criticizing them, and they purposely shoot with more accuracy or try to, then that's altering the actual results of the experiment, and it's technically research bias, as they're being told one thing and they're acting a way to please the researchers so they can get the result they want. There has to be a protection from psychological harm, because obviously being shouted at or being punished for doing certain things can cause your mindset to feel like you're not good enough, or you're really bad at the sport, and makes you want to be discouraged from it. And obviously that's not the purpose of the experiment, but if the experiment went a bit too far and it caused psychological harm, that could happen. Therefore, if someone was in the team was to feel like that way and it got reported, the research could lose bases accreditation, which means that their work will be looked at in a way and it not give it credit, as the research would be void sort of thing. All their work would be looked into to see if it was followed the ethical thing and the ethical principles, and future work wouldn't be wouldn't get ethical clearance easily. They'd have to reprove and even retrain in ethical training to prove that they do understand what's going on, so they don't cause harm or do research that could harm people. So that would mean no more work within a certain area of subject, and obviously data protection. So if these girls agreed to it and didn't want their names published or the results published, then they'd have to make sure that the data is protected and name the participants different names. So subject A, subject B, participant 1, and so on. Scenario 3, 1 rep max bench press after taking pre-workout supplement. So if they're taking supplements, they have to make sure there's a health screening and medical questionnaire to make sure they're not allergic to anything and know they're not going to have a reaction to one of the supplements. In this one, there's going to have to be a double-blind deception, as the researcher can't know what supplements being taken, and the participant can't know, as they might change their performance and psychologically do better. So if the researcher knew when they were taking this one, they could be like, oh, come on, you should do better than this, you've got this supplement, blah blah blah, whereas they could be just taking water, so instead they could just be having water or some supplement that's got nothing to do with it, and then the results would be actually down to the performance.